Good afternoon. I think we're just about ready to start our 2 o'clock session. Just to introduce myself, and then I'll hand over to our presenter today, Tom. My name is Rebecca Bushell. I'm a marketing manager at Triodos Bank UK, one of the world's leading sustainable banks. And today we're hearing from Tom Nutt. So I'll just pass over to Tom.
Brilliant. Thank you, Becky, and good afternoon, everyone. My name's Tom Nutt. I'm head of the corporate practice at Grayling in the UK and Europe. Grayling is a full-service communications agency operating globally, but principally in the UK with our 9 offices in the major cities of the country. So I'm going to talk through today a concept that we're terming new collectivism. And the reason why we think this is particularly pertinent to today is that ultimately the pandemic has shifted forward a huge number of trends that we believe were already happening, but have brought them into sharp focus and present an opportunity to what the politicians would call building back better. But what we're focusing on is building better businesses. And the crucial element of this, as we see it, is that for the last 30 or 40 years, there has been a sort of central thesis of the way businesses need to operate as profit before all things, that effectively a shareholder-led economy was there to provide the greatest wealth and growth to those shareholders, which would hopefully trickle down through employment, through consumer spending, into a more profitable world that ultimately delivered better outcomes for the people who lived in it. Our belief is that while there are elements of this thesis that still work, ultimately it has proved not to be the total solution that modern developed societies need, and we need to think differently about how we do that. We also need to think differently because the challenges are ever greater. And obviously the central ones that we've faced over the last sort of 18 months around a global pandemic, and the more pressing and longer term ones around subjects like climate change and population growth and aging populations, etc., that are the global megatrends that are going to define the next 20 to 30 years, but ultimately the outcomes of which will be decided in the next 5 years. So, in looking at what new collectivism is, we have sort of wanted to look at this from the perspective of purposes for business in a post-COVID-19 world. And I think it's fair to say that COVID-19 has been a shock to global business, and it has been a shock to the sort of developed societies that had sort of lived, as we would term it, in a safe and unhindered way for really since the Second World War. And ultimately, this change to the way we've had to live our lives has had many negative outcomes, but we would hope some positive ones as well. And ultimately, we're framing this from the perspective of how can businesses better serve the communities that they operate in, and indeed, do they have a responsibility to do all of that? We're calling this new collectivism because we think that term neatly encapsulates what is required to meet the challenges that society is facing right now. The kind of drivers, if you like, for new collectivism, we have termed around a much increased pace of change through greater technology adoption, but ultimately through societal change that has taken place in the last 18 months. A understanding that collective responsibility is required for meeting the world's biggest challenge, and that no one can really miss out from that. A new generation of leaders that are, broadly speaking, millennial in age and outlook, who are leading a Gen Z workforce, who are demanding different things from their employers, but also within that, the conscious consumers that require different things from the brands that they trust and the businesses they want to work with. All of this is done with the eyes of the world on it. Greater technology adoption has meant that people the world over now understand both positive and negative externalities of business and are much more politically engaged, even if that doesn't always mean that they vote. Within that, you also have a more pertinent element to business, which is employees are more activist, both in their personal and professional lives. They want more from their job, and they also want more from the world around them. And we feel that there's a need, and in fact, a great opportunity of channeling that to make those individuals a more powerful force within your business. I think one of the things that we've been most excited by, and I think obviously the vaccine creation and rollout in the developed world has been part of a much more moonshot style approach to solving the world's problems, and we see this as a huge opportunity for that to return to broader swathes of life and in a very positive way. And ultimately, this end of either or, we see the world's challenges and the challenges that are facing businesses. While it has choice within it, there are no options now. They have to be met, and future communities are very much reliant on today's society solving those problems. So what do businesses think about this? So in shaping this hypothesis, one of the things we wanted to do is, rather than just say, well, this is what we as a communications agency think, we wanted to speak to businesses to find out how they were meeting the challenges and what they felt about our broad hypothesis and their future role within it. So we spoke to and surveyed over 500 senior European business decision makers earlier this year, and this is what they told us. They were very comfortable with the idea that there is a collective responsibility that businesses have to the communities they serve. So 63% of those leaders in large firms, so employing over 250 people, say that alongside making a profit, they have a collective responsibility to the societies they operate in. And that responsibility is beyond just employing people, which is obviously a very positive thing and something that any organization is going to be supportive of, but ultimately it goes further than that. And it is about having a positive impact on society, not having a negative environmental or social impact, and ultimately understanding that there is a license to operate for businesses today that they have to be conscious of, and that ultimately, and something that I haven't covered yet, but is crucial within all this, governments will act. And I think one of the things that has been so critically important in the pandemic is, in the main, developed country governments have made huge impacts in both business and personal life of both the companies that operate in that space and the people who live in it. I would posit that in the main, these are not necessarily positive things, but they have been necessary things. And ultimately, what that has reminded governments of is that they can intervene and they have significant power. They are not going to deny themselves that power in the future, but hopefully they aren't doing it because of a global pandemic, but because of a business operating in a way that society doesn't see as positive. So there is both carrot and stick in this. The carrot is that consumers, employees want it, and society wants it more broadly. The stick, if you like, is that governments will intervene, and the broad consensus that existed for the past 25 years that the market will make the decision has gone. And we can argue the pros and cons of that, but ultimately businesses now need to operate with the understanding that behaviours that are not societally benefit will be regulated or intervened with by Western governments. In terms of this idea of collective responsibility, which we feel is the positive externality, if you like, of new collectivism, so 85% of leaders agreed that collective responsibility was important for the future prosperity of their business. They also, 94% also agreed that it was important for the future social prosperity of the country where the company was based. So critically here, we have this huge cohort of business leaders who truly understand that their future success is intrinsically linked to understanding the impact the business can make, and that ultimately a positive business operating in a positive manner will benefit society at large. And we see this as the kind of huge opportunity that can shape business thinking for the next 15 to 20 years and will be positively rewarded in commercial success. And that's the exciting bit, and the bit that really creates the collective desire in commercial organizations to have a positive impact on society. In terms of whether we are moving fast enough, and I feel that this is kind of the singular challenge in this. Only 43% of business leaders say communicating about sustainability will be a priority in 2021. And I feel this number is too low. I think it should be much, much higher. The reason many of them see this as a struggle is they feel that a continued emphasis on the global pandemic can limit that conversation, and politicization of the issues can also be an issue. I would say that these are challenges that need to be met by business leaders and business as a whole, and that ultimately a focus on sustainability, a focus on the positive impact and purpose of businesses will only lead to more positive outcomes. And ultimately, the risks of not communicating about these things are greater than the risks of doing it. I also feel that for the seismic impacts of COVID-19 over the last 18 months, we are moving to the end game of the pandemic in the major developed economies with the vaccine rollout, and quite frankly, because a very significant number of people within populations have actually had the disease. And while there are surely more bumps on the road, it cannot be seen as the primary focus of businesses to mitigate that, when there are, I would argue, much larger, more long-term issues to be grappled with, and that businesses need to act as leaders within that, because if they don't, then governments will act on their behalf, or consumers will seek other businesses or service providers that are acting. So I would say that there is a race at the moment to serve that consumer need and to avoid government interventions of a negative nature. And ultimately, that is the challenge of the next 2 to 3 years for major businesses across the UK and Europe. In terms of what our report recommends, and I don't think all organisations need to do all of these things, but we wanted them to act as a thought starter for areas that could be huge focuses for businesses over the next 2 to 3 years. We passionately feel that leadership through vision is important, that for an engaged employee set, for consumers and B2B customers to truly understand your business, you've got to have that vision. You've got to demonstrate how a business is going to operate in a more positive way for the long term. Decentralized decision making, we feel that all businesses need that agility, and in order that you create a framework that businesses can operate within, but also that there is autonomy and entrepreneurial thinking to solve the issues that business will be facing, we think that's critical. We also see environmental scenario planning as a central plank of any business. You have got to think how your business, your supply chain interacts with the world around it, and how it can be more positive in its interactions rather than the potential sort of risk mitigation approach that is often taken. Speaking of risk mitigation, a long-term view is crucial. All businesses that have been operating on a kind of quarter-by-quarter reporting cycle are unlikely to take a view for the next generation, but that's critical to solving the challenges that we face, and also critical to delivering a sustainable, profitable business for the long term. We think cultural monitoring is an interesting area, and is something where particularly international businesses need to understand the societal change that is taking place with major interest groups that will deliver, you would hope, positive societal change and a more progressive agenda, to understanding how to interact in that environment and not find yourself on the wrong side of debates through either ignorance or deliberate obfuscation. We feel that employee panels is an important part of the interaction between decentralized decision making and leadership through vision. If you're able to understand more clearly what the people within your business, who should be your greatest advocates, think, then you will understand society as a whole. Accountability is critical. You've got to be transparent in how you operate, and you should make a virtue of it. In a way, I think far too many businesses fail to understand that being transparent about your failings will make society at large, regulators, governments, etc., be more tolerant that you are trying to solve them than if you try and hide it and hope you don't get caught. There is definitely a need for a huge swathe of businesses to tell bigger, bolder stories. It's a very clustered environment out there. There's a lot of noise, and you've got to cut through it with really interesting, impactful stories about how your business is making a difference. And ultimately, partnership is part of this. Finding new leaders, whether they be within your organization or partnerships with potentially even rival organizations that demonstrate a collective desire to make society better, is absolutely critical. All of these things, we believe, come together in the new collectivism methodology, which we feel is a critical way of viewing the future for commercial entities and indeed the public sector as well, that if you are passionate about meeting the challenges of the future, it is likely success today will be an integral part of that. So I'd like to sort of break there and sort of discuss that in more detail.
Thanks so much, Tom. I think I'll start off because I've got some questions for you. Thank you so much for sharing that report, really, and a massive thank you for doing that. I think it's the pandemic has taught us many things, and it's certainly highlighted the need for businesses to have a rethink. If the people and the planet aren't at its core, then I think a lot of what's happened in the pandemic has made them reevaluate. So thank you for that. It's great. Sort of touching on that, the obviously we've seen the pandemic highlight this need for the rethink, this need to embrace the sort of collectivism as you're terming it. What in these sort of crucial next few years, as you highlighted, what more can be done to sort of keep that momentum going, keep that on the agenda? Is there anything we can do as businesses to make sure that that's always front of mind, and we don't, in the busyness of getting back to growing and rebuilding, forget that, really?
Well, I think it'll be incredibly hard to forget that, to be honest. I think the reality is that there will be a huge latent demand from, whether it's I'm terming consumers as potential B2B customers as well. I mean, I think we're all consumers in our own different ways. And ultimately, to meet the needs of an audience that is likely to be ever more engaged, you're going to have to. So I just don't think it's optional. I don't believe that businesses will be able to go, well, we've worked out our hybrid ways of working, we've done an audit of our supply chains, it's all fine, let's just sort of get on with the old ways of doing things. I think the sort of getting back to normal, all these sort of phrases that they're meaningless. Like, the genie's out of the bottle. People are going to behave differently as a result. I think the kind of hybrid working elements, I think, are interesting, but they're not really the core of any of this. The core of this is understanding a responsibility that a business has. And I think that ultimately it will be around listening to the people working in the business, because I think that's going to be the kind of the clearest and quickest route for any organization to be able to adapt, to be able to reflect society at large. I think that is a great starting point. I don't think businesses as will do it particularly well, to be honest. And I also think that the linkage to hybrid working in that is quite crucial, because one of the things that I've observed from particularly leaders that I've advised over the last 18 months is their disconnect from their businesses. And ultimately, I think a lot of people were reliant, and I would say that, you know, men are probably more guilty of this than women in leadership, but on reliant on being present, on being a personality within an organization. When your workforce is dispersed, and many of them are in different geographies, and they're probably, you know, at least some of the time they're going to be working from a space that they choose, not that you choose. You're not going to be able to communicate with them in a town hall way or over email or whatever you did in the past. And actually, what you probably need to do is, rather than just have this sort of top-down visionary statement and hope that everyone kind of aligns with it, you're going to have an active conversation with your own organisation, which hopefully is able to reflect a conversation with society at large, or at least acts as a starting point for that conversation, and then potentially expand it from there. But to be honest, if you're not having that conversation with your team and your staff, then you're probably missing, one, a huge opportunity, but also you run the risk of disengagement, which I think has, again, been a very big challenge over the last 18 months. I think the workforce, particularly in the UK, has adapted incredibly well to the significant challenges that we have faced. But I think it's not going to go back to the way it was before. And I think as soon as people sort of forget that and move to a new way of operating, it's going to be much more two-way, it's going to be much more conversational, and it's going to need lots of different digital tools, some of which we have today, some of which we may not have today. And I think ultimately, a lot of this will come down to the amount of time and effort organisations are willing to take to communicate with their own staff. And I think it's been an afterthought for too long, and that will only leave you in a very difficult place. In terms of how it stays sort of front and centre, I think, again, it has to start from the top. I think it has to be a stated aim. And I think that sort of purpose that I often talk about has to be kind of set in stone, publicly communicated, socialised within a business. And it has to be a commitment. You have to judge yourself against it. And that should mean that you have no option. And I think in a lot of cases, businesses run the risk of giving themselves too much wriggle room because they don't want to commit to something. But actually, committing to something gives great leadership. But also, if you don't sort of meet your own targets or you don't match up to them, as long as you're able to clearly and succinctly and transparently explain, you're likely to get the reputational benefits either way. And I think a lot of organizations don't necessarily understand this. But for instance, the example I would give was recently Tesco had to come out and explain that its 2016 pledge to reduce plastic consumption within the organization by 80% will be missed. Well, what was brilliant about that was it allowed them to tell the world that it had a 2016 pledge, which, to be honest, most people have forgotten about and probably didn't know about at the time, because at the time, plastics weren't the central and critical issue that they are today for both FMCG brands and major supermarkets. So it actually acted as a reminder that they were slightly ahead of the curve on that particular thing, even though they had ultimately failed to reach their target. They hadn't failed by much, so actually it still sounded pretty good. And I think more and more people need to understand in organizations that setting a target, getting close, and being transparent about the journey to it is going to be the critical way of communicating. I also feel within that you know, there needs to be kind of the short, the medium, and the long term. I mean, I look at, you know, the UK government talks about net zero by 2050. Great. Yeah, I think we'd all be supportive of that. It still seems quite a long way away. When we get closer to it and find we're not going to get to it, well, that's a different conversation. But if you're able to set, you know, staging posts on the journey, then again, you've got an opportunity to communicate. And I'm always going to frame this in that way because that's my skill set. But ultimately, I think that gives you the kind of commitment as an organization and as a leader that you need, but also allows you to do the mea culpa when, for whatever reason, you haven't succeeded, as long as you explain why and what you're going to do differently. I think you will find audiences are sympathetic to that. What they're not sympathetic to is faceless organizations trying to not explain things. Again, it's a pretty obvious truism, but people like being talked to as if they're people. They find it very hard when you talk as a sort of faceless automaton, and they react very badly to it, quite rightly, in my view.
Yeah, I wholeheartedly agree, Tom. And I think you've hit on the sort of two main things then, isn't it? You know, in terms of internal communications, I think you know, we've certainly felt it within the bank, and I think everyone else has felt the same. The importance, you know, that is such a cornerstone now for businesses, and needs to be sort of higher up the agenda than I think it's been in previous years. And also transparency, as you say, if you're transparent and open and honest and explain, and as you say, talk to people, you know, with the right kind of approach and language and compassion and honesty, they're going to respect you for it. So wholeheartedly, and you bring them on the journey with you as well. Joanna's very kindly, and we've got two other questions. So Joanna's asked, how do businesses manage the need to become more sustainable and talk about it, and the risk, though, of being accused of greenwashing? So by the sounds of it, you know, creating that balance and being sort of true to the truest forms of when we mean sustainable, we mean sustainable.
Well, I mean, I think the reality is that you have to be able to communicate what you can do, and what will require partnership. And again, that comes into the new collectivism thinking, and also what you feel the expectations of your stakeholders, employees, regulators, you know, government, whatever it may be, are. The risk of greenwashing should, in theory, be zero if you're doing the right thing. And I think ultimately the sort of the gesture elements are the bits that don't work. And also trying to have a sort of long list of elements that are not all kind of equal in terms of their impact is again not necessarily a particularly good thing. My personal view is that the risk of being accused of greenwashing is always smaller than people think. And ultimately, there will always be dissenting voices who say you could do more, you could go further, you could go faster. But providing you have a strong, detailed, and credible rationale for the actions you're taking or the reasons that you're doing something, then they should only be minority voices. And ultimately, if your business practices stand up to scrutiny, then it should be okay. In fact, it should be better than okay. My personal view is that greenwashing is where you're trying to maintain that something that is either a legal requirement or something that you just do as a matter of course is some great innovation. That's when you're going to fall foul of these things. But if you're kind of clear, concise, and robust in what you're saying, the risks shouldn't be there. And I do also say in all of this that one of the things that I feel, again, very passionately about is that people can accept very complicated ideas and difficult things and trade-offs if you explain them properly. And one of the things that I feel, and this is sort of probably a very personal view about what's happened over the last 18 months, is there has been, particularly by government and communications around the pandemic, has been this belief that people won't understand things. People will. People will understand very, very complicated things, providing you explain them in a kind of clear and concise manner, which is not always straightforward. But there is no point in thinking that communities and society won't understand trade-offs, won't understand balance, and won't understand responsibility. They absolutely will. But again, going back to the point about you have to communicate with people as if they are people, that's central to it. But don't think your audience can't understand complexity. It absolutely can.
That's great. Thank you, Tom. We've got another question as well in terms of how have you found that many organisations have been taking on this report so far? What's been the uptake? And I'd sort of add an addition to that. Have you seen perhaps any of your clients or partner organisations or anyone actually starting on that journey or putting out a sort of pledge to say, yes, we do want to do this, and it might take us a few years to get to a certain place or to reach, to change a certain business practice or so on, but we committed to do so?
Simple answer is yes. The report has been very positively received. I think because a lot of businesses struggle with kind of a starting point. And what has been quite interesting in all of this, and again, I can only speak from the perspective of being an advisor on communications, but what we have found is by centering it on that part of the business, it kind of allows you to sort of reach out into other parts of the business. So yeah, sometimes I'm afraid to say this comes from this, perception of risk. So, businesses are fearful of, being caught out. That's not where I want to start a conversation, but if that allows, if that's the catalyst, if you like, I'll take it. But in the main, it's about businesses understanding that they are going to be dealing with different consumer trends and different government actions, and they need to be able to think about how they're going to adapt to that if they need to, or how they can take advantage of that. And I would say it's kind of a benign to negative point as in risk, or it's a positive advantage opportunity point. And obviously I'd much rather talk about the latter, but some people are more risk averse, and that's fine, we can advise. What I have observed is an understanding of the opportunity, and it goes back to the point about activist employees, and it goes back to conscious consumers. So I think that has been the most heartening piece. There has also been, and I think quite rightly, a thought through most of this year as to, the pandemic is dominating our thinking right now, but it will end. We don't know exactly when, but it will. What's the next thing? How do we kind of, how do we win in a post-pandemic world? What are we going to need to do differently? And let's start that thinking now. So at a point whereby we're not having conversations about whether you should wear a mask in a shop or what social distancing means for the hospitality industry, but we're having a conversation about what does society need for the long term across a whole panoply of different things. How as a business can we operate in that environment? And how do we take advantage of it? And I think the reality is, for a lot of the clients that I have advised over this period, they have not been as adversely affected by the pandemic as they feared in April 2020. And I think there's a sort of, what happened probably this year was a kind of slight collective sigh of relief, and then a thinking of, okay, it's going to be all right, well, what do we need to do next? And I think that for me, the reason we wrote the report was that here's a guide to how you start thinking about what you can do next, but also understand that you cannot go back to October 2019 and expect the world to be the same. It's just not. I would say for the huge negative impact of the pandemic on lots of elements, there will also be a huge amount of positive that comes out of it. And I am probably maybe a little bit ambitious in this, but my suspicion is over the next 10 to 15 years that the pandemic will broadly be forgotten, but the positives of it will be embraced. And I think that's the interesting element of it. If it is the beginning of a series of major global pandemics, then I'm completely wrong, and that's unfortunate, and we will react accordingly. But my central thesis is that the pandemic has sped up lots of positive things that should have happened anyway, and for the very sad elements of it, that there will be, I'm very confident, some very positive societal elements as well. And I hope we're able to keep some of the societal elements, community elements that I think were very positive. I think that's in the balance as we speak right now, because I think a lot of people are quite tired of the whole situation. But I am sort of confident that the positives will be felt for a good few years to come, and a lot of very positive things have been sped up as a result. And it's about businesses and organisations adapting to that and taking advantage of it for the benefit of the people who work for them, and the services and products they supply to a very conscious consumer set that's only going to become more so.
Thanks, Tom. And Catherine has put in the chat, to quote Mark Carney, if businesses don't adapt, they will go bankrupt. They will potentially, be extremely damaging for them. And I think that's sort of linked to another question that I had. We've got something that we're keen to convey all the time is the importance of where you hold your money, basically, and how money is being used for good. And with 70% of greenhouse gases coming from the top sort of 100 kind of FTSE companies, not saying that those are all of them aren't making these sort of transitional changes and changing to suit, but I think is there anything more that they should be doing? Would there be any clients that you'd love to pick out and say, actually, we really think that you can do great things and make really long lasting changes to sort of try to change that, and tackle that huge issue, basically? I just wondered if anyone stands out for you, or if there's any sort of one thing you'd want them to do better, apart from maybe look at being more sustainable. Was there anything else that you think they could do to create sort of long-lasting change?
Well, I think one of I wouldn't want to sort of pick out any one organisation, either that I work with or I don't, but I think one of the singular challenges that I feel in the climate change discussion is around the built environment. And I think I'm right in saying 30% of the developed world's CO2 emissions come from the built environment, either the construction of new buildings or the operation of them as offices, homes, or whatever else. I think that for me seems like a very good place to start. And that, again, I think is where the new ways of working need to come into play, whereby organizations think very carefully about what their needs are from a kind of fixed infrastructure perspective, if you like, because ultimately that is a very large chunk of greenhouse gas emissions that needs to be thought about differently. Now, the technology required to do that and all those good things is not my area of expertise, but it does strike me as a singular opportunity. And it's not just simply about having smaller offices, although that may play a part, but it's about thinking about the built environment in a different way. And I think that the kind of major property developers, some of which are in the FTSE 100, have a huge responsibility there. I think we need to think differently about how our cities operate, because I think we are still, whatever people, short-term think about, there's this sort of huge exodus from cities, and everyone wants to work remotely, living in lovely parts of the rural British Isles, which I'm sure is true to some people, but most people don't have that opportunity. So, the reality is the cities will only get larger. So the built environment and how cities operate strikes me as being the kind of the difficult bit that will make a huge difference, but also is very much core to the new collectivism thinking, because no one actor within that can enact change. So if you're thinking about, state operated mass transit, if you're thinking about town centres, if you're thinking about homes and offices, if you're thinking about consumer trends within how people live their lives, all of these things are going to have, their part to play. And I think that, again, a collective rethink of how cities can maintain their place as kind of centres of economic and cultural development, and the agglomeration effects you get of bringing people together, but do it in a way that is less environmentally damaging, strikes me as the kind of the 21st century challenge. It's also a challenge that if the developed world gets it right, and there's a long way to go, then the developing world, which again is urbanizing at an even faster rate, will reap the benefits, and they can, leapfrog to whether people term it smart cities or more technologically enabled cities that are less environmentally damaging, then that will be hugely important to meeting the climate change challenge over the rest of the century. But it is so complicated, and there are so many different parts that need to come together, that it's going to take genuine civic leadership, genuine organizational change within businesses that operate in major cities, and probably consumer change as well. But that for me would be the kind of the most important thing to change. But I'm afraid the limits of my expertise mean I can't go much further with that.
No, that's great, Tom. That's great. And one thing, just if anyone else does have any more questions, please do put them in the Q&A section. But I was really interested in the report where you went to talk. You sort of explored the thought of now having 3 bottom lines. So not the traditional bottom line as we've heard about. There's actually 2 more, and encouraging that shift, encouraging that movement to businesses doing good and putting their contribution to society at the sort of core of what they do as well, and being a part of a positive part of society. And I thought it was really fascinating and sort of complements a lot of work that's going on. I think Professor Tim Jackson talks a lot about a different kind of capitalism now, and we should be harnessing that with a move to, it's not all about making money, it's about, making a difference. So I wondered if you could just touch on that briefly to end, if that was okay.
Yeah, definitely. And I think the critical element for this for me is that the 2 are not mutually exclusive. And I think that's the crucial point, that by measuring your sort of social, economic, environmental impact as well as your profits, it allows you to demonstrate your value as a business much more easily. And I think the crucial point is, again, I start this thinking from a reputational communication perspective. And if you're able to show clear metrics to the sort of the triple bottom line theory, then the world at large will understand that, and they will give you the reputational sort of either benefit of the doubt or genuine kind of impetus behind it. And I think for me that the crucial thing there is that by demonstrating you care enough to measure it and report on it, you're saying a lot more about your organization than merely we are very profitable, we employ X people, whatever it may be. And I just think you'll be given huge benefits from this. I think these are opportunities to take. I'm not saying it's that straightforward to do all of these things, and that's where the investment needs to be, and that's where the commitment needs to be. But I would always maintain that investment and commitment will be more than repaid by the wider stakeholder group, consumers, and that again becomes central to new collectivism, because it allows you to report on how you are operating as a business as well as how much money you're making. And there's no question that by giving yourself that challenge, and that's what capitalism does best is it solves these type of problems. Well, let's harness it in the right way to deliver a much broader positive outcome for society at large.
That's great, Tom, and I think it's probably a perfect way to end the session. I think, with a drive forward for a new way of doing things that is mutually beneficial for all and changing in perspective. So thank you so much for today, and thank you so much for everybody's questions, and thank you. Enjoy the rest of the session.
Thank you very much, and thank you all.
Thanks now. Bye bye.